14 men came to hunt me. By sunrise, only I was left. The dogs went quiet first. Then the forest held its breath. They thought I was running. I wasn't. I was counting. 6 years in chains taught me how things break. Locks, bones, and men who think they own you. They called me slave. That night I called myself free. My name is Bass Reeves, and before I carried a badge, I carried revenge. 62 Arkansas, 14 hunters, 1 survivor. If freedom cost blood, would you pay it? Subscribe and comment your state below. They kept a book for everything on that plantation. 1 ledger for cotton, 1 for tools, and 1 for pain. Each page told a story in numbers. Who was whipped, how many times, and what instrument was used. It was called discipline, but everyone knew it was science for cruelty. The man who wrote those numbers was named Robert Hutchins, owner of 4,000 acres and 200 souls. He believed order could be measured, and he measured it with blood. Every strike was recorded like math, every scream reduced to ink, and every lesson carved across someone's back to remind the rest of us what obedience looked like. That ledger didn't just keep track of flesh, it kept track of fear. And fear was the only thing Hutchins truly believed in. I was bought for $900, a small fortune for a man with skin like mine. The note beside my name read, "Unusual physical capabilities and mechanical aptitude." They meant I was strong and smart. A dangerous combination in a place built on silence. I was put in the blacksmith shop, a furnace behind the main house where sweat became language and fire became teacher. They paired me with a German man, Otto Brenner, who could make metal sing. He was a craftsman, not a sadist. And though he called me boy, he spoke with less venom than most. He showed me how to bend iron, how to test a hinge, how to find a weak point in any chain. He thought he was teaching me a trade. He didn't know he was teaching me how to escape. In that shop, every sound mattered. The hiss of water, the rhythm of hammer to anvil, the slow breath before each strike. It taught me patience. It taught me control. And control, that was the one thing the South feared most from a man like me. I didn't talk much. Didn't laugh. Didn't pray out loud. On plantations, silence was armor. The talkers got noticed. The notice got punished. I learned to answer only when asked, and even then, to give just enough to end the conversation. Otto once said, "You worked like you're listening to something no one else can hear." He was right. I was listening to the rhythm of this place, the heartbeat of its cruelty, the sound of keys, boots, patrol dogs. I learned when men slept and when they woke, when they drank, when they forgot to load their pistols. 6 years I kept my mouth shut and my eyes open. 6 years memorizing every inch of Hutchins' empire, from the stables to the punishment house. That punishment house. I still see it. A one-room shack with iron hooks in the beams and a single lantern that never went out. Inside, you didn't hear prayers, only the creak of rope and the rasp of a whip sliding back into a bucket of brine. Men went in crying. They came out hollow. That was Hutchins' pride, his calibrated discipline. He said it kept order. I said nothing, but I counted. Every scream, every chain, every man they broke. They thought obedience was power. But they never saw the other kind, the kind that grows in silence. Patient and steady, like roots under stone every now and then, Hutchins would ride out with his overseer. Harold Vickers, a man who smiled while burning flesh. Vickers carried a branding iron with a mark shaped like a H. He said it stood for Hutchins. We called it hell. Once I was ordered to repair the iron after it bent out of shape. I held it under the flame, hammering it straight, and for one dangerous second, I imagined pressing it against Vickers' chest instead of the anvil. The thought scared me, not because it was wrong, but because it felt right. That night I decided something. I would not die in chains. If I couldn't live free, I'd make sure the men who thought they owned me remembered my name the way I remembered every mark on my back. The Civil War began in 1861. The white men went off to fight for their right to keep us. Some died in blue coats, some in gray, but we stayed, feeding their families, building their barns, burying their sons. They said the world was changing. But on the Hutchins plantation, nothing changed. Whips still cracked, chains still clanked, and the ledger kept growing. By the time the war reached Arkansas, Hutchkins had lost half his labor force to escape or rebellion. Still, he believed his system worked, that pain kept people in line. He didn't understand that pain also teaches. Pain taught me timing, calculation, endurance. Pain taught me how long a man could bleed before he broke. And when the chance came to leave, pain would make sure I didn't miss. The forge became my school. Each piece of iron I shaped carried a secret. A hinge that could fail, a lock that could open, a shackle that could slip loose with the right twist of wrist. I built weapons without knowing I was building them. I studied men without them knowing I was studying them. In that hell, I became something they didn't have a word for. A patient storm waiting for wind. The others whispered of freedom like prayer. I whispered nothing. Freedom wasn't a word to me. It was a calculation, and every day brought me closer to the sum. The ledgers say I was obedient, efficient, dependable. That was the last lie they ever wrote about me. Because a man can't measure obedience forever. Eventually the numbers stop adding up. The day would come when my silence broke, and the sound it made would echo through Miller County. Chains hitting wood, boots hitting dust, and the sound of one man finally answering his name. Miller County, Arkansas, a ledger for cotton, a ledger for pain. One man reading both. Would you have waited 6 years in silence for one perfect chance? The forge was the only place on that plantation where a man could breathe fire and not be punished for it. Inside, heat made everyone equal. Iron didn't care about color, only pressure. When the bellows roared, even Hutchkins' voice faded. Every strike was a heartbeat. Every spark, a thought I wasn't allowed to speak. And somewhere between hammer and anvil, I found a language they couldn't read. I learned early that a hammer isn't just for shaping metal. It's for teaching patience. If you swing too soon, the metal cracks. Too late, it bends wrong. The right moment comes from listening, feeling when the iron's ready. That's how escape works too. You don't rush. You wait for the exact second when the world goes soft enough to change shape. Otto Brenner watched me like a man watching thunder build. He said I had a mechanical mind. What he meant was I saw how things fit. Not just bolts and hinges, but people. Every man on that land was a mechanism. The overseer's habits, the guard's footsteps, the way keys hung from belts. If you study a machine long enough, you learn how to break it. Otto didn't know I was studying everything. How the gates locked, how the wagons were packed, how Hutchkins trusted me more than any man he owned. He called me Bass, no last name, no family, just a sound he could command. But in the forge, I kept my own name, the one my mother whispered before she was sold south. I repeated it in silence every time the hammer fell. Bang, my name, bang. My promise, bang, freedom. Some nights I'd stay after dark pretending to work. The air was thick with soot, and the smell of sweat mixed with smoke until you couldn't tell which was which. That's when I'd test small things. An old padlock I'd taken from the scrap pile. A piece of chain I filed down until it slipped apart with one twist. Little experiments that no one would notice. Not yet. I learned that iron remembers pressure. Push it too hard, it resists. Ease it slow, it gives. People are the same, so I learned when to nod, when to lower my eyes, when to make a man believe he'd won. That was my art, making obedience look natural. They thought I was loyal. They thought silence meant peace. But silence, when sharpened, cuts deeper than a blade. Hutchkins once told a visitor I was the perfect worker. He said I had no spirit left to break. I smiled and handed him his tools. If he'd looked closer, he'd have seen his reflection in my eyes, and maybe realized the mistake he'd made. Because by teaching me his world, he'd taught me how to end it. He made me repair shackles until I knew every flaw in their design. He made me shoe horses until I learned how to calm them with a whisper. He made me carry chains heavy enough to crush a man's spine. All the while, I was learning what weight freedom might cost. And somewhere along the line, the forge stopped being a place of work. It became a classroom for vengeance. The day I saw Otto watching me through the haze, I knew he suspected something. He didn't say it, but I saw the worry in his hands, the way they trembled when he passed me the hammer. He once said, "Bass, your eyes look too calm for a man in bondage." I told him maybe calm is what comes before the storm. He didn't speak after that. He just nodded like he understood too much. By then, I'd been waiting 6 years. 6 years to see an unlocked gate. 6 years to watch Hutchkins' confidence rot into routine. 6 years for one mistake, and I knew it was coming. The plantation was bleeding men to the war. Patrols got lazy. Supplies ran thin. Even Hutchkins looked older, slower. He still beat men like he was proving something. But the fire in his strikes had cooled. He thought the world couldn't change. He was wrong. Every sound in that forge was a prophecy. The hiss, the crack, the clang. And the last lesson I learned from iron was this: the hotter you make it, the easier it bends. The same goes for men who think they're gods, so I waited, day after day, blow after blow. Until one morning, I saw Hutchkins oiling his pistol, telling the overseer he'd ride to the county courthouse next week, with me driving the wagon. That was the moment the metal in my chest turned solid. I didn't pray. I didn't smile. I just nodded, knowing that the road east would no longer lead me back. The forge had given me everything I needed: patience, silence, and a weapon that didn't need sharpening, my will. Miller County, Arkansas, a forge, a fire, and a man learning how to bend the world. Do you think the quiet ones are the most dangerous? At night, the fields spoke in whispers. Not words, just sounds. Corn leaves brushing like voices afraid of being caught. Crickets masking what we dared not say in daylight. That was when news traveled. In pieces, in code, in breath. A baby born on the next plantation. A man whipped to death 3 miles south. And sometimes a miracle. Someone who made it north. We called it the grapevine telegraph, an invisible line that carried truth faster than horses could. The masters never saw it because they never listened to the ground. But I did. Freedom was a rumor that traveled by footsteps. You heard it when a new overseer arrived short one man. You saw it when a cabin stood empty for too long. Most who ran were caught. Some disappeared into the swamps and never came back. The night they brought back Moses, a field hand with a scar like lightning down his arm, I saw what capture looked like. Vickers dragged him behind a horse, shouting scripture. The dogs tore at his legs until the screams didn't sound human anymore. They left him hanging by his wrists in the punishment house for 2 days. When they cut him down, he couldn't speak. That night, he still tried to hum a hymn. The sound gurgled out like broken wind. The next morning, Hutchkins wrote it in his ledger. Attempted escape corrected. That was the moment I stopped waiting for deliverance. God hadn't forgotten us. Ben had the war was moving closer. You could hear it in the distance. Cannon rumbles carried by wind. The white men at the plantation gate whispered about battles, taxes, and soldiers coming home without pay. But I didn't care who won. I just wanted a way out. So I started gathering pieces. Not weapons, information. One of the cooks, Aunt Liddy, heard things from the house servants. When Hutchkins would travel, which routes were safe, which weren't. A stable boy told me which horse never spooked at gunfire. And the blacksmith's wagon, I knew its every bolt. I built a map inside my head. Every road, every river, every patch of thick pine where a man could vanish. But plans without timing are just dreams. And dreams in a place like that get you killed. It was October 1862 when the whisper finally reached me. The master's going to Texarkana next week. Courthouse business. That was my signal. Every 3 months he went to file papers, check contracts, and drink brandy with county men who pretended the war didn't exist. He always took a slave to manage the wagon, load supplies, and hold the horses while he talked. This time he said my name. You'll drive, he told me. You've got the strength for it. He thought he was giving an order. I knew he'd just given me a door. For the next 7 nights I prepared, quietly, carefully. From the forge I took a coil of rope, 2 small tools, and a piece of burlap to wrap around my hands. From the stables I loosened the reins on the strongest mare. From the kitchen I traded 2 iron nails for dried bread and salt. No one noticed. No one ever noticed the man they thought was broken. But I wasn't broken. I was bending. Aunt Liddy caught my eyes one night while serving supper. She looked at me too long, like she knew. Then she whispered, "Don't come back unless you bring thunder with you." Her voice trembled, but not with fear. With belief, the fields grew colder as November crept in. Smoke from the big house chimney hung low, heavy, tired. People sensed something shifting, though they didn't know what. I prayed without words. Not to be safe, but to be ready. One night, while the overseer's lantern moved away, I whispered to the dark, "When I go, I'll make sure no man hunts me and lives." It wasn't anger. It was a promise. Then came the day. Clear sky, cool air. I climbed onto the wagon bench beside Hutchkins, just like always. He wore his white coat and carried his ledger under his arm. I wore the same thing I always did: sweat, scars, and silence. As the horses started forward, I looked back once. The quarters, the forge, the faces that never looked up, and for the first time, I realized something. Freedom wasn't a place. It was a decision. That decision had already been made. The wagon rattled east down the dirt road, leaving the plantation behind. I held the reins steady, but my heart was steady too. Every turn, every mile, every sound of hoof or chain, I'd studied them all for years. Now they belonged to me. When we reached the courthouse, Hutchkins climbed down, still talking to himself, waving papers at some clerk in a white shirt. He didn't look at me. He never did. He didn't know that the man sitting behind him wasn't his slave anymore. He was his executioner, Miller County, Arkansas. A whisper in the fields. A name on a ledger. A plan forged in silence. Would you risk others' lives to buy your own freedom, if you promised to come back for them? Texarkana was loud that morning. Wagons clattering, soldiers shouting, traders arguing over cotton that would never see another port. The courthouse sat in the middle of it all. A whitewashed building with red seals over its doors and a clock that never kept time. Hutchkins liked to arrive early, tip his hat and talk like the world still belonged to him. He handed me the reins and said, "Keep the horses calm. I won't be long." That was his first mistake. I watched him walk up the steps, boots clicking like nails on a coffin lid. He disappeared inside with the clerk, papers in hand, ledger under his arm, the same one that had recorded every lash, every scream. Every life turned to arithmetic. The street around me buzzed, women in shawls. Soldiers home on leave, farmers shouting over the price of nails. No one looked twice at another black man holding a wagon. For 6 years, I'd been the invisible one. Now that invisibility was my weapon. The chains lay coiled in the wagon bed, heavy and cold. Tools beside them, iron hooks, rope, burlap. I'd packed them myself. My pulse matched the rhythm of the blacksmith's hammer in my memory. Bang, breath, bang, decision. The moment came quiet, like a held breath breaking. The courthouse door opened. Hutchkins stepped out, talking to the clerk about property lines and taxes. He looked straight through me, same as always. When he reached for the driver's bench, I stood beside the wagon, head bowed. He never saw my hands move. The bundle of chains swung once, a bright blur in the sun. The sound it made was thick, metal against bone, a dull crack that ended a lifetime of ownership. Hutchkins dropped like a puppet with the strings cut. The clerk shouted. Someone fired a warning shot. I didn't wait to see if he lived. I grabbed the reins, snapped them hard, and the horses bolted east, hooves pounding dust into thunder. Shouts behind me turned to chaos, orders, screams, gunfire. The courthouse clock struck 4, but I was already miles away. I steered toward the timberline where the road narrowed and shadows grew thick. Every tree looked like a doorway. Every heartbeat was a drum saying, "Go." When I reached the first bend, I threw the ledger into the ditch. Let the South keep its numbers. I was done being one. Behind me, the alarm spread like fire. The rifle shot meant slave escaped. Within minutes, the town was a hornet's nest. 18 men answered the call. Overseers, bounty hunters, desperate drunks who smelled reward money. $300. That's what they said my life was worth. They didn't know I'd already paid the price in full. The sky turned red as the sun sank behind the pines. I rode hard for the low country, where the Sulphur River twisted through swampland. The horses snorted, foam flying from their mouths. Every sound felt sharper. The croak of frogs, the rustle of something moving in cane grass. When darkness fell, I pulled the wagon off the road and cut the horses loose. They deserved better than the chase that was coming. I took only what I could carry. Rope, knife, rifle, and the memory of Hutchkins' eyes the second before the chain hit. I expected guilt. What I felt instead was silence, heavy, clean, final. The same silence I'd lived in for years now turned outward. I slept that night under a cypress tree, pistol in hand, back to the trunk. The moon hung low and swollen, lighting the river like a strip of white steel. I could already hear them forming posses in my head. The dogs, the shouts, the horses. They'd be coming at dawn, but this time I wouldn't be the one hiding. They were. They just didn't know it yet. By morning, the smell of smoke drifted from the west. Texarkana had sent its hunters. 6 rode the main road. 6 cut through the timber. 6 looped north to block the border. 18 in all. The number repeated itself like fate. I smiled for the first time in years. Let them come. The forge had taught me math, and I knew exactly how to subtract. As I moved deeper into the woods, I left signs, false tracks, broken branches, bait for men who thought tracking a slave was simple sport. I knew their minds better than they knew mine. They were predictable. I was not. The forest swallowed me whole. Branches clawed at my clothes. Owls screamed overhead. But I kept walking, one slow step at a time, every footfall planned, every breath measured. They wanted to run away. What they got was a reckoning. That night, rain fell, soft, steady, perfect. It washed the blood from my hands and the road from their maps. By dawn, the chase had begun. They thought I was the one being hunted. They were wrong. I was the one waiting. Texarkana, Arkansas, white walls, red seals. 1 chain, 1 strike, 1 vanished man. Would you have swung the chain, or waited for the world to set you free? They split like a wagon wheel. 6 on the road, 6 through timber, 6 looping north to close the mouth of the county. 18 men, 3 spokes. One mistake. They thought dividing numbers made me smaller. But I'd learned different math at the forge. Break a thing into pieces and you don't always weaken it, unless you're the thing doing the breaking. The road team moved loud, trusting daylight and badges borrowed from fear. The timber team moved sure, letting the dogs nose the air like they owned it. The northern loop moved quietest of all, confident I would run for Indian territory the first chance I got. I didn't run. I rested. I sat under a low cedar where the wind kept its voice and listened to the dogs far off. 3 different notes, 3 different distances. I could tell which handler yanked too hard on the leash, which horse favored a bad shoe, which man chewed tobacco and spit left because the wind would carry scent right. I didn't need to see them to know them. Men leak information. The forest collects it. When the first 6 hit the bend in the road, I left them a story made of footprints. A slide down to the creek, a scuffle at the bank, a heel mark that said, slip, not step. They crowded the waterline like boys at a fair. 2 knelt. 1 mocked the others for doubting their hounds. I was already above them, 30 yards back where a deadfall sat waiting. Weight coiled over a spring of patience. A snapped twig, a turned head, a touch of curiosity at the wrong time. The log fell like judgment. It didn't kill him. The creek did after I pressed him under with both hands. 4 feet of water is enough for a man who believes he rules rivers. The second went down softer. I caught him at the shoulders from behind and closed my hands around his throat like tightening a horseshoe. He kicked, clawed, tried to bite. I didn't speak. I just counted. Breaths. Then none. I took their cartridges, their knives, and the fine little bone-handled compass the third kept in his vest to feel brave. Bravery lives in habits. I gathered those too. I moved deeper, not farther. Using a rule the forest had taught me. Distance is not safety. Angles are. The timber 6 followed dog faith, trusting noses more than eyes. Dogs love certainty. So I took certainty away. I smeared a cold mash of creek mud, crushed pine, and wild onion on one of the horses I'd cut loose the night before, then slapped it toward a thicket I had no intention of visiting again. The dogs screamed like horns. Men followed. Every shout said the same thing. Property must be returned. Every step said something different. We don't know what we're chasing. The first in timber died to a snare I set at knee height. A loop of hemp tightened with a whisper and pulled the way a smith draws wire. He fell sideways, rifle clattering, and I stepped from a shadow and finished what the rope began. Second tried to fire blind into brush. Blind fire tells the shooter where he is, not where you are. I moved behind the trunk he used for cover and broke his wrist with a club no one had catalogued. 1 length of hickory, planed smooth by time. He begged. I had no language for that left. I ended it clean. By nightfall I had 2 rifles I liked, 1 pistol I trusted, and the quiet kind of hunger that keeps a man precise. I ate dry bread the size of a palm and drank the creek until my stomach stopped arguing. Then I slept in a place made of 3 choices: high enough to see, low enough to vanish, narrow enough to force a man to turn his shoulders if he came. Shoulders turned, our throats offered. It's a rule, like gravity. The Northern Six tried clever. They set a false camp in a clearing, left embers bright for bait, and posted 2 sentries who thought stillness meant invisible. Stillness means statue. Statues can't hear. I lay 20 feet inside a wash of shadow and measured their breathing. Slow in, slow out. Then a cough, dry, thin, night broken. Every group has a weak hinge. I pressed it. 1 sentry went to the trees. He did not come back. When the second stepped to look for him, I put a hand over his mouth and let my other hand do the remembering. The camp never woke. Silence, once learned, makes the whole world your accomplice. By the 3rd day, their math had fallen apart. The men on the road had found prints and fear. The timbermen had found traps and ghosts. The northern loop had found that circles don't hold when the center won't stay put. So they made a new center. Taggart, a man with a hunter's posture and a shotgun filed to hurt without ending profit. He smelled like old Victory and rock salt. He knew dogs and men. I respected that. Respect is not mercy. I followed them at a distance you measure with breath, not yards. Watched how Taggart placed his feet, how he drank, small, regular, how he stared too long at ground when his eyes should have been checking trees. Hunters who fall in love with sign forget sign can be written by the hunted. That night, they chose a camp with water on 2 sides and confidence on the 3rd. They posted watches 1 at a time. 1 at a time is a decision made by men who still believe morning belongs to them. The moon slid out and back again. When it returned, I went with it. Shadow traveling within shadow. Patience wrapped around my ribs like extra bone. I stepped where pine needles were thickest, where the sound of step became the sound of pine. Taggart slept with his back to a log and his hand on the shotgun. His breath was the kind that had never been chased. It met my hand like a secret. He did not suffer long. I've seen too much pain to love it. His companion woke to the wrong quiet and reached for a weapon that wasn't there. I left him breathing. Not mercy. Message: the leader is gone, go home. Tell them the math is broken. By morning, the 3 spokes had turned into 2 frightened lines. Men who call themselves hunters don't walk the same after they feel death sit down beside them and ask their names. I kept moving. Not away, but around. Stole a horse, then released him 2 valleys over. Buried a pistol I didn't trust. Cached cartridges in a hollow stump. The forest and I were partners now. Me doing the planning, it doing the hiding. People say what I did was murder. Maybe they're right if the ledger they love counts only my hands. But I had read another ledger. The one where a man's back is a page and pain is ink. Slavery is a book that writes itself in other people's blood and calls it order. I tore out pages. I refused the binding. I wrote a new entry with the only tool they left me. By the time the sun bled out behind the pines on the 4th day, the number was 14 waiting somewhere ahead, like a verdict. But I already knew how that verdict would read. I was not running. I was subtracting. Arkansas pine country, 18 split to hunt 1. One learns their math and breaks it. If they hunt you as property, do you owe them mercy? If you're still watching, you care about buried history. Subscribe now so stories like this never vanish again. By the 4th night, the woods smelled like wet gunpowder and fear. The rain had stopped, but the earth still breathed smoke from every campfire they'd lit trying to keep courage warm. Taggart's men were shrinking by the hour, not in number, but in heart. I could tell from the way they rode. No one laughed anymore. No one shouted orders. Even the dogs had learned to whisper. The forest had turned against them. It carried my silence through the branches, made their own footsteps sound louder. They began to feel watched, because they were. I followed from close enough to hear their teeth clatter on tin cups, close enough to smell their sweat turning sour. A man's fear has a scent, sharp like iron cooling after fire. When darkness came, I waited for the same mistake every man makes when exhaustion starts whispering lies, believing that night will protect him. They made camp beside a narrow creek, horses tied, rifles stacked. 3 guards on rotation. One slept between shifts with a pistol under his hand, trusting the dogs to wake him. But I'd already taken that sense away. Dogs see shapes. Men see shadows. I made myself neither. I crawled through the wet brush until the smell of bacon grease hit my nose. That's how close I was. The first guard stood near the fire, shifting from foot to foot, his eyes half closed. I waited for the sound that always gives a man away, the long exhale. When it came, I moved. 2 steps, a slip of rope, 1 sharp pull. He dropped without a cry. The fire popped louder than he did. I eased him down, took his knife, and melted back into the dark. The second guard woke 20 minutes later, wondering why he hadn't been relieved. He walked off to check. He didn't come back either. By dawn, Taggart was alone and didn't know it. He woke to silence. No dogs, no men, just the slow hiss of water boiling in the pan beside the ashes. He sat up fast, hand going for the shotgun, eyes wide, looking everywhere but behind him. The woods had already erased me. I watched from the ridge as he paced in small circles, muttering names. Patterson, Cole, Wicks. Names of ghosts he'd buried without knowing where. Then he did something that almost made me respect him. He knelt, pressed his fingers to the ground, and whispered a prayer. Not to God, to the hunt. When he stood, I saw his shoulders sag. Even hunters know when they've become the hunted. That night, I ended it. No drama, no vengeance speech. Just the quiet efficiency the forge had taught me. I slipped through their camp like smoke, the rain masking my steps. Taggart slept with one arm across his chest, shotgun under the other. I moved his weapon first, slow enough that even the fire didn't flicker. When my hands found his throat, he woke just long enough to see my face. Recognition crossed his eyes. Not of who I was, but what I'd become. The chain he'd helped tighten around others was finally around him. It took less than 10 seconds. Longer than mercy, shorter than justice. I laid him back, crossed his arms, and left his shotgun across his chest like a soldier's burial. He believed in order. Now he was part of it. I didn't take everything. Only the rifle I liked and the compass that had belonged to the first man I drowned. Everything else I left where it fell. Let the forest decide what to keep. The next morning, searchers found the camp. Rifles untouched, food still warm, horses tied and restless. 14 dead in all, none with bullet holes. The sheriff called it impossible. The locals called it cursed, but I didn't need their stories. I had my own ledger now, and every mark on it was paid in full. I spent the next 2 days moving through low ground, staying close to water. The sound helped me think. I thought about Hutchkins, the man who thought he could measure pain. I wondered if he could feel the weight of all this from his bed. If he lived, I wanted him to know. His system had failed. His property had rewritten the equation. That night, I built no fire. I sat under a pine, wet and shivering, eating cold meat from my pocket, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not joy, not victory, just the absence of command. For the first time since Tennessee, no one was giving me orders. No one owned my name. No one could record me in a ledger again. The forest had taken me in, baptized me in rain, and handed me back as something unrecognizable to the world that made me. They called me fugitive, killer, outlaw. But that night, sitting in the mud with the compass in my palm and Taggart's rifle across my knees, I realized something simple. You can't be a fugitive from a life you never chose. You can only walk out of it and make the world adjust. When dawn came, mist rolled over the trees like smoke from an invisible forge. I rose, shouldered the rifle, and started walking east. Every step felt lighter than the last. Every mile I became less of what they made me, and more of what I decided to be. Behind me, the dogs were quiet forever. Arkansas wilderness, 14 men gone, and 1 man finally breathing free air. Is patience the sharpest blade? Most men who escape never look back. They run until distance becomes safety, until their names dissolve into new tongues. But freedom that leaves others behind isn't freedom. It's exile. The forest could have hidden me forever, but I didn't come this far just to survive. I came to end something. 3 weeks after the last hunter fell, I was 30 miles east of Miller County. I could have crossed into Louisiana, maybe found the Union lines. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the punishment house. The hooks, the ropes, the faces. And I heard Aunt Liddy's voice, "Don't come back unless you bring thunder with you." So I turned around. Not toward safety, toward memory. Toward the place where silence had been law. I moved at night, sleeping by day, using the same trails I'd studied for years. Cold wind rolled off the Red River, carrying the smell of wood smoke and decay. By the time I reached the Hutchins plantation, the moon was thin as a blade. From the ridge, the land looked smaller than I remembered. The quarters, the fields, the big house on its rise. But I could feel the same weight hanging over it, heavy as iron. 3 white men patrolled the yard, rifles slung, boots loud. They didn't expect ghosts. They expected obedience. The stable was my first target. 4 walls of dry timber stacked with hay and oil lanterns. I remembered every beam, every hinge I'd forged with my own hands. I crept in through the east door, spread oil on the floorboards, and set a small flame with the flint I'd carried since the woods. It took fast, oil licking upward, hay crackling like dry laughter. The horses screamed. Within seconds, the night exploded with noise. Flames leapt high enough to wake the sky. Men ran shouting, rifles clattered, orders dissolved into panic. That's when I moved. I slipped through the smoke toward the punishment house, that black wooden cell at the edge of the compound. The door was locked. I smiled. I'd made that lock myself. It took me 3 seconds to break it. Inside, 2 people lay shackled to the wall, a man and a woman, both half-conscious from hunger. Their eyes went wide when they saw me. I whispered, "If you can walk, follow my shadow." They didn't ask who I was. They just followed. Behind us, the overseer, Harold Vickers, shouted for water and order, trying to sound like command meant anything. But fear makes a liar out of every leader. He turned just in time to see me step from the smoke. We locked eyes, the man who branded backs and the man he'd branded. He raised his pistol. It jammed. God or iron. I don't know which helped me, maybe both. I closed the distance in 3 strides. His shot went wild, grazing my arm. Pain didn't matter anymore. We hit the ground hard. He reached for the pistol again. I caught his wrist, twisted until bone cracked, and used the same chain I'd struck Hutchins with to finish what began in Texarkana. When it was done, I laid. The branding iron across his chest, the letter H cooling against his flesh. It didn't burn him. It marked the truth. The house of Hutchins was finished. By dawn, the stable was ash, the horses gone, and half the quarters empty. 6 people vanished into the trees with me, the 2 I freed and 4 more who ran when they saw the flames. The plantation would never recover. Neither would Hutchins. He lived, but the blow from Texarkana had left him half broken. They said he stumbled out in his nightshirt, bleeding from the head, shouting my name into the smoke. But I didn't answer. I'd already spoken once. He'd felt it. We crossed the fields together, barefoot and bleeding, moving fast before daylight. I showed them how to follow the water, how to cover tracks with pine needles, how to listen for dogs before they barked. They were terrified, but I wasn't. Fear was something I'd already spent. By midday, we reached the tree line. From there, the plantation looked like a dying sun, fire eating everything it once used to feed. The big house, the barns, the fences, all turning to smoke. It looked like freedom. I told the others to split up once we reached the river. Groups draw eyes. Solitude survives. They didn't want to leave me. The woman I'd unchained said, "You ain't scared?" I told her, "I was scared for 6 years. That's enough for any man." We said nothing else. Words were too small for what the night had done. When the last of them vanished into the trees, I turned once more to look at the fire. For the first time in my life, I saw the plantation exactly as it was. Not a home, not a world. Just wood and chains built by men too weak to face their own sins. Now it was burning. And somewhere in that crackle, I heard every scream I'd ever swallowed. They were louder now. Free, Miller County, Arkansas. 1 fire for the horses, 1 door for the living, 1 iron for the dead. Would you go back into hell to open 1 door for someone else? When men run out of courage, they start building fences. The Confederates couldn't spare soldiers for the hunt anymore. War was chewing them up faster than pride could replace them. So they changed the game. No more wild chases. They made a net, roadblocks at ferries and bridges, mounted patrols rotating in neat little squares. Checkpoints at crossroads where the dust never settled. Not pursuit, containment. They thought a net would catch a fish like me. They forgot I'd learned to breathe underwater. I watched their pattern from the pines for 3 days. At sunrise, fresh men took posts with clean boots and louder talk. By noon, swagger wilted into routine. Just before dusk, they changed shifts again. Papers checked, rifles swapped, guards counting hours instead of tracks. There in the middle of their good order lay a gap small as a whisper, regular as a heartbeat. 40 minutes. Every afternoon, a window made of human nature. I didn't move yet. First, I needed a different kind of weapon. One made of ink and trust. A free black farmer named Samuel Hayes worked 2 miles off the river road. Living thin but proud with a tiny field and a tin roof that sang when the wind ran its fingers across it. He kept papers, certificates that said he belonged to himself. He'd earned them with sweat and stubbornness, and he guarded them like saints guard relics. I approached at dusk, empty hands out, rifle slung low so it looked like a burden, not a threat. We spoke without names at first. In those times, names were doors. Open the wrong one and wolves walked in. I need to borrow your face, I said finally, tapping the fold in his coat where the paper slept. He stared a long time. Then he looked past me toward the west, where the sky bruised purple over fields that still held men like cages hold animals. You aiming to free more than you? He asked. Yes. He held my eyes like a weighman testing coin. Then he nodded once and set the papers on the table. He also set a knife beside them. Bring both back, he said. I want a future that looks like my own handwriting. I'll try, I told him. I don't make promises to wind or war. He smiled thin. Then make one to me. I did. With a hat pulled low and a coat that didn't belong to me, I stepped out the next day like a man with errands. The road patrol looked me over with the quick, practiced boredom of men who believed paperwork made truth. I handed them Hayes' name. They believed it. Papers turn suspicion into inconvenience. And inconvenience is lazy. They waved me on. I didn't travel alone the whole way. From the fire, 6 souls had followed my shadow into the trees. No great band, no bold parade. Just people moving in singles and pairs. The way rain moves down window glass. I separated them near a stand of sycamores. Sent 2 north where a church lady kept a bread oven and a quiet mind. 2 south toward a ferry operator who knew how to look past a man, and 2 deeper east to wait in a pine hollow, until night rubbed the edges off the road. They wanted to clutch together like children in a storm. But storms find crowds first. Solitude survives. We said our goodbyes with eyes, not mouths. On the 3rd day inside the net, rain slicked the clay roads and turned wagons into prayers. Checkpoints sagged, tempers rose, and the afternoon shift grew sloppy. I walked past a captain who lectured a private about boots while I counted the heartbeat of the gap. 37 minutes, 38, 39. At 40 I crossed, not a sprint. A steady board man's stride. Hat brim low, jaw loose, hand around a lead rope like there was a mule somewhere behind the fog. No one asked. People rarely question what looks ordinary. Ordinary is camouflage the rich don't know poor men wear. I slept in ditches and fence corners. Ate in churches and smokehouses when the door opened, and an old woman's eyes said, "Hurry." Once a boy put a heel of cornbread in my palm and closed my fingers like he was teaching my hand to pray. I didn't know how to thank him, so I didn't. Some gifts don't want witnesses. At one place, a patrol rode up while I was inside. I stood in the doorway and pushed my back against the jamb, as if I were part of the building. The sergeant liked to talk. Men who like to talk don't like to notice things. By the time he'd proved something to his men about authority, the rain had thickened, and so had my luck. The grapevine telegraph carried more than food and shelter. It carried geometry, where the traps were, who took bribes, which ferrymasters asked for names and which asked for songs. Keep to the ruts. Fresh prints die fastest, one man told me. Cross the road on stone, not dirt, a woman added, putting warm cloth on a cut I hadn't felt open. I learned to listen to the land and the people like they were the same thing. Because they were? Once, a young private at a checkpoint asked too many questions. He stared hard at the scar along my jaw, then at the brand near my wrist. "Where'd you get that?" He asked. "Blacksmith," I said. "Metal bites when it's hot." He smirked, but not at me, at his own cleverness. "I'll remember that." "No," I told him in my head. "You won't." He waved me through so he could tell a joke to someone who would laugh. Laughing men see nothing. I doubled back twice in one day to confuse anyone counting my steps. Left a bundle of cartridges in a hollow stump for hands I'd never meet. Stole a glance west where smoke sometimes smudged the horizon, and wondered if Hutchkins still woke at night clutching a pistol he didn't trust. The map in my skull was changing, roads turning to threads, fences to lines I could step across, the net to something I could fold and pocket like a handkerchief. Freedom wasn't a place. It was a method. On the 7th day inside their perimeter, I crossed the Sulphur River 10 miles north of the picket line. I timed the crossing to the hour their watches stuttered, the sacred gap between men leaving and men arriving, when both believe the other is watching. Cold water climbed my chest and bit my ribs. For a second, the river pushed me backward like a hand on my throat. I pushed back. Came up on the far bank with mud in my teeth and a laugh in my lungs that sounded like a cough. Alive is a sound. Behind me, the net held nothing. Ahead, the land turned to argument. Union here, Confederate there, fear everywhere. Perfect, papers in my pocket. Compass at my breast. Names in my head I meant to return one day like borrowed tools. I didn't look back. Not because I was brave. Because I was busy. Arkansas backroads, a county of soldiers, a man of silence, and 40 minutes of daylight freedom. Is survival a prayer or a kind of war? The sulfur took the first weight off me. Cold enough to bite bone, fast enough to judge a man's will. I went in with the papers of Samuel Hayes pressed to my chest and came out with my own breath, ragged but mine. On the far bank, I lay flat in cane and listened. No dogs, no men. Only the slow speech of water sliding past roots telling me the net behind had closed on air. I laughed once, quiet, ugly, like a cough with hope in it. Alive is a sound. After the sulfur, the land broke into quarrels. Soldiers, in gray on one road, blue on another, and whole counties arguing about which color their fear belonged to. That suited me. Arguments make gaps. I was a man who lived in gaps. I kept the Hayes papers folded small where my heart beat. When a sergeant with a temporary mustache asked who I was and where I was going, I showed him a name he could file. He saw ink, not scars. He saw a neat signature and a steady face and waved me through so he could get back to shouting. Papers make men lazy. So does certainty. The days thinned and sharpened like knives. The nights thickened, smelling of wood smoke and wet leather. Each morning, frost hung on the grass like a prayer not yet said. It was near Christmas, or what passed for it in a country busy bleeding itself. I moved like a man on errands, hat down, pace even, a rope in my right hand as if a mule trailed me somewhere just out of sight. I slept in hedgerows, fence corners, church vestibules that creaked when the wind knelt at the door. I ate what hands placed in mine without counting the kindness. Cold ham, hard cornbread, a cup of coffee that shook in its saucer because the woman pouring it had learned the cost of shaking. I left things behind when I could. Cartridges in a stump, a scrap of map drawn with charcoal, words whispered to those who still lived behind fences, where the road bent around a sycamore, where the guard liked to nap, where the ferryman asked for a song instead of a name. If I couldn't pay debts in coin, I paid them in roots. Twice I thought the war would choose me before I chose my crossing. Once when a patrol questioned the brand near my wrist too long, their eyes crawling over old letters like they could read a man's past in raised skin. Blacksmith's bite, I said, and held the stare steady until the sergeant looked away first. Once when a boy soldier demanded I sing a hymn and I started the wrong verse, but his captain laughed and called me pious and told us both to keep moving because snow was coming. Snow didn't come. Rain did, soft as mercy, and the clay roads turned to soup. Good. Mud erases decisions. I reached the Arkansas River, then kept east, following the rumor of gunboats like a man follows music down a hallway. Cannon thunder sounded low and patient on some distant bend. When the wind was right, I could smell powder on the water like iron you could breathe. I watched the water for 3 days, studying how the current argued with itself around snags and bars. Rivers don't lie. They only test you. On the 4th morning, I found a crossing where driftwood gathered in a crooked arm, making a path that wasn't a path. I waited for the patrol on the ridge to trade jokes and spit, then for the priest's bell in a little town to ring noon, then for the long, bored yawn of a man who believed routine meant safety. Timing is a tool the forge gave me. I used it. I tied my rifle high across my back, stuffed my pockets with stones to keep balance, and stepped into the river like it was a room I had papers for. Halfway across, the bottom fell out, and the cold took my breath like a fist. I counted 1, 2, 3, until my chest remembered to work. On the far side, I crawled through cane and threw up water that felt older than the war. I didn't thank God out loud. I didn't dare wake his attention. By dusk, I saw the first blue coat that didn't raise his weapon at the sight of my skin. He raised it because that is what soldiers do. Then he lowered it when I said, "Name's Hayes," and held out the paper like a bridge between us. He took me to a Union picket post where 3 men and a sergeant stood around a fire they pretended wasn't warming them. They asked questions the way careful men pick a lock, click, 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 listening for the truth to line up. Where from? West. What are you? Free, if you say so. Why here? Because the other direction is wrong. They smiled at that, not because it was clever, but because it sounded like a thing they could believe and write down. Then they asked the question the river had not. What happened to the men they sent after you? I told them 14 did not go home. I didn't say it with pride or shame. I said it the way a blacksmith says iron bends hot, plain, true, and hard to argue with. The sergeant stared at me a long time. He sent for an officer. Officers wear questions like coats. They brought me to a camp where tents huddled like tired thoughts and coffee smelled like a reprieve. An officer with winter eyes sat me on a crate and listened while the night leaned close. I gave him places and methods, not speeches. How the first drowned in 4 feet of water because he believed rivers were shallow. How the second went to, his knees whispering a name that didn't answer. How the leader died as quiet as sleep because some endings should not wake the world. He wrote until his pencil stuttered. Then he asked, "Do you regret it?" "I regret the ledger," I said. "I regret the hooks in the punishment house. I regret the dog that learned to love screaming." "Not what I asked," he said. "No," I told him. "I don't." He nodded like a man who understood that answer was the only honest one. Then he gave me bread, hot this time, and set a blanket across my shoulders like a verdict I could live with. They called me refugee, first then scout when I walked their perimeter, and pointed at the places the enemy loved more than truth. They wrote my name wrong on a roster, and right in their memory when I brought back a map that matched the morning's cannon. A soldier gave me a tin cup and told me I belonged to the army now. I didn't belong to anyone, but I could work with men who wanted the same enemy to lose. I slept that night without counting. On the far side of the river, a different world began to breathe me in. Eastern Arkansas, a false name on paper, a true name in the dark, a river that doesn't forget. Once you reach the line, are you still the same person who left? They gave me a blue blanket and a number. I kept my own name. In the Union camp, everything had a place, tents in rows, rifles stacked like wheat, orders pinned to boards where wind read them first. Men talked loud to hide what they feared. I didn't talk. I listened. The captain learned quick what silence can do. He sent me out with 2 soldiers the first night to feel the edges of the land, fences, creeks, the way moonlight crawled over a rail line. At dawn, I brought back a map drawn in charcoal on ration paper, with a cross where the enemy hid corn and powder. Cavalry rode at noon. By supper, the corn burned. Scout, the clerk wrote beside my wrong name. I didn't correct him. Truth don't need spelling, days became missions. Slip out, count boots without being counted. Mark where wagons turn heavy, where hoofprints double back, where a guard scratches the same ear every hour because boredom is a disease. I learned the rhythm of gray coats, the way I once learned the rhythm of hammer and iron, a beat you feel in your ribs. Sometimes I returned with more than drawings, words from churchwomen who cooked for both armies, warnings from boys who watched bridges the way boys watch rivers in flood. You pay people for trust with something better than coin. You pay with roots. The colonel read my notes like a man drinking water after salt meat. Good, he said when Cannon testified that my lines were true. Again. I went again. Not every mission had orders stamped on top. Some debts don't travel on paper. Word came of a slave catcher working the border, a man named Chenoweth who dragged people back under the law like a fisherman hauling nets. 60 names clinked from his belt in stories told quiet. Some said he'd hunted me the week I broke the county, but missed me because greed sent him elsewhere. I didn't ask permission. Took a knife and a coil of patience and walked into the pines. Chenoweth kept dogs in a circle of light like gods on chains. I fed them meat laced with sleep. Then I watched him sleep too, the kind that trusts tomorrow. I ended it like a prayer with no words. When the river took his lantern glow away, I left his papers under a rock for hands I'd never meet. The army never asked where I'd been. War has more questions than men to carry them. Some nights the past walked into camp like rain, quiet and everywhere. A civilian prisoner was brought in, caught near our lines with a rifle and too much story in his eyes. He said his name was Vickers, brother to a man I left in the dirt on a night of fire. He asked for me without knowing he was asking for me. The colonel called me to the tent. Vickers' hands shook when he saw my face. "Did you kill my brother?" He said. "I survived him," I said. "It was the same thing," he shouted, called me animal, devil, thief of God's order. I let the noise pass over me like rain on a tin roof. When he ran out of thunder, I spoke. "Your brother rode to return me to chains. My hands did what chains always demand. Break." I stepped closer so he could smell the river on me, the powder, the iron. "If you plan to finish what he started, do it now. If not, go home. Live. That is mercy you didn't bring me." His mouth worked, then went still. The colonel sent him to exchange. I never saw him again, but I know which way his shoulders sagged as he left. Away from me. Away from the work. The army wrote its own entries. "Corporal," one paper said after I marked a hidden store and a wagon road the gray coats thought their mothers knew. "Commended for reconnaissance," another read. After I slipped through a swamp that chewed boots to leather soup and came back with the angle of their guns on a bluff. What the papers didn't write. The woman who pressed a biscuit into my palm and said, "My boy ran last winter. Tell him the road still waits." The man who loaned me a hat and a story and took both back with a nod that said we were even. The church bell that hid my footfall when a sentry coughed in the wrong direction. The nights when I slept with my back to a tree hearing frogs pronounce the same verdict over and over. Live, live, live. I kept 2 ledgers. The official one wore ink. The other lived where heartbeat lives. Soldiers asked if I felt bad about the 14. Some asked mean. Some asked scared. Some asked like they wanted permission to do their own killing without the night chewing them after. "I feel the same as a man who pulls his hand from a fire," I told them. "Relief, and skin that remembers." The chaplain tried scripture. I tried quiet. We both kept our faith. Once a young private walked beside me on picket and said, "How do you disappear like that?" I pointed at the ground. "Be part of 3 things, shadow, pattern, and patience." He laughed and asked for a 4th. "Know what men believe," I said. "If they believe they own the morning, take the night. If they believe they own the road, take the ditch. If they believe the loudest voice wins, whisper and watch them lose." He didn't write it down, but later I saw him choose a ditch. He lived. The war dragged its heavy coat toward spring. Blue and gray traded places on fields that forgot names as quick as rain. On a cold morning when ice wrote its own map on tent flaps, the colonel handed me a cup of coffee and said, "When this ends, where will you go?" "Forward," I said. He smiled like it hurt. "Then keep your feet pointed the way your eyes are." I did. They finally put my height and my scars on a discharge paper and spelled my name the way the clerk thought names should look. "Served with distinction," it said. It didn't say how. It didn't say why. It didn't need to. I folded the paper small and tucked it beside my heart the way I once carried another man's freedom. Wind moved the tent. Somewhere a bugle started a song the ground didn't know the words to yet. I stepped out into morning like a man stepping across a line no map could show. Union lines 1863-1865. One uniform. Same silence. Maps for the generals, debts for the dead. Do courts invent justice or only name it after the work is done? They say paper remembers what men forget, but even paper lies. My name sits in some archive now, folded under dust and signatures of men who never saw the woods burn. They wrote that I served with honor, that I was discharged in good standing, that I could claim a pension one day. What they didn't write was what I carried in silence, the weight of 14 names I never asked for, and the strange peace that came from never being hunted again. History calls that peace freedom. But freedom, I learned, isn't light. It's a shadow that asks what you had to kill to stand inside it. After the war, I walked through towns that didn't know me and watched people rebuild lives on bones they refused to name. Plantations turned to farms. The whips turned to ledgers, and the same men who once sold flesh now sold lumber and cotton, still calling it God's work. Nobody asked what happened in Miller County. No preacher mentioned the fire that took a stable, or the punishment house that no longer stood. They called it a Confederate loss. That's how they hide a sin and rename it something military. The freedmen whispered my story, though, in fields and churches, at wells and wakes. They spoke of a blacksmith who'd turned his chains into weapons, a man who'd killed every soul sent to cage him, and then vanished into Union blue like a ghost that learned to wear a uniform. Children heard the name, Bass, and grew up thinking it meant something more than a man. It meant a reckoning. Years later, I heard rumors about another Bass Reeves, a lawman in the territories, a deputy marshal who could outshoot any man and drag killers back alive. They said he never missed a shot, never took a bribe, and carried the kind of silence that made even judges lower their eyes. Some said he was me. Some said he just wore the echo of my name. Maybe they're both right. Maybe the man I was had to die in the river so another could wear the name clean. Maybe that's what rebirth looks like when the world won't grant you one. All I know is this: men like me don't get graves with names. We get stories that wander, stories that haunt courthouses and riverbanks and the dark corners of memory where truth hides when it's scared of power. Once I went back, not to Miller County, but close. The road curved past where the Hutchkins plantation used to be. Nothing left but moss and silence. The punishment house? The big house, burned. But the land still knew me. The wind still spoke in the same low hum, like iron cooling after fire. I knelt and pressed my hand into the dirt. It didn't care who I was. It only cared that I was still breathing. That's when I realized the ground doesn't keep score. It just takes everything back. Otto Brenner, the white blacksmith who once taught me leverage and temper, wrote a letter he never sent. I read it years later when I was an old man hiding behind another man's name. He wrote, "The men he killed believed they were hunting property. They died learning they were hunting a human being. History will call him murderer or hero depending on who does the writing. But what else could he have done?" I folded that letter slow like prayer cloth and thought, if even one white man could see truth clear through the smoke, maybe the world still had a chance to learn. The sheriffs of Miller County buried their failure deep. Records marked the dead as misadventure. Ledgers skipped the months I turned hunters into hunted. Their sons grew up thinking their fathers died in the war. Their grandsons named streets after them, but their widows knew better. Every time the wind rattled a window in the night, they thought it was me, and maybe it was. Because memory has a way of walking through walls history tries to build. As for me, I didn't leave much behind, just a rifle hidden in a stump, a compass that stopped working the day I crossed the Mississippi, and one promise still burning somewhere in the dark: never again. Never again to be counted on another man's ledger. Never again to ask permission to breathe. Never again to bow my head when I knew the weight of chains was lighter than lies. If they call that vengeance, let them. If they call that freedom, let them too. I just call it balance. Now the historians can argue. They'll say I was myth, exaggeration, folklore carried by freedmen who needed heroes. Let them argue. The truth doesn't live in their ink. It lives in the way the land grows quiet when you say my name. It lives in the silence between hammer strikes, in the stillness before thunder. It lives wherever men learn that no one owns another's breath. Some nights I still hear the dogs, far off, in dreams that smell of pine and fire. But they never find me, not anymore. When I wake, I look at the hands that once forged shackles and remember they also forged keys. That's the part history never writes. It prefers the chains. So if you ever walk through Arkansas and find yourself standing in a field too quiet for comfort, Listen close. You might hear the forge again, the slow rhythm of iron against will, the whisper of smoke telling its secret to the wind. That's where I left the sound of my name, not written, not carved, just remembered 14 shadows in the trees, one man who stopped running, and a country still learning what that means. Arkansas to eternity. One ledger burned, one name reborn, one truth buried shallow. Do you think history remembers the truth, or just the men who write it? If you're still here, share this story. Subscribe and let the silence of Bass Reeves speak again.